Hello and welcome to another Live from the IT Room podcast presented by Supreme Systems. I'm Julian and today I'm going to be discussing hosted infrastructure with my very special guest Scott Harris, Chief Executive Officer of Egenera, the pioneering cloud services company founded in 2000 and provider of the industry-leading Xterra hosting platform. Hi Scott, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hey Julian, thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. Before we get started, I'd like to give some background on cloud infrastructure and its increasing relevance for UK businesses. The cloud has been a buzzword in the IT industry for the past 15 years or so, but my own experience in the UK SMB sector has been that it's only recently that hosted infrastructure has become truly viable for mid-sized businesses. So what changed? Well, primarily two things. The first thing that changed is that businesses now have plentiful options for connectivity, a more recent development than you might think. It's only in the past 5 years or so that 100 megabit plus connections have become available to businesses at the sort of prices that SMBs are willing to consider. The next thing that changed is that many businesses woke up one day to the realisation that they've already transitioned to a hybrid cloud infrastructure. This is because many companies organically migrated from on-premises Exchange mail servers to cloud-based Office 365 services, and many more went a step further than that by swapping out their file servers for cloud storage such as SharePoint, or by moving from locally installed versions of their accounting or CRM systems to newer hosted versions as the vendors made them available. So this experience of actually using cloud services in their day-to-day activities has given them confidence in hosted infrastructure as a whole and a desire to look at other ways that hosted infrastructure can save them money, increase their efficiency or offer flexibility. So Scott, UK businesses are finally giving serious consideration to moving their remaining IT infrastructure to the cloud. Why do you think 2020 is the right time? What are the reasons why this year is better than past years?
Well, Julian, 2020 has a few unique factors. To start with, there's been some pretty impactful end of service life actions, namely Windows 2K8, Windows 2008. It was a widely used, and honestly still is a widely used operating system. So if you must migrate anyways, then that becomes a question of why not to the cloud. There's other items that also sort of revolve around that, and that is the acceptance of the cloud, as you mentioned before. And a lot of analysts have been reporting on this, and they all agree that 2019 was a big year as a turning point for a lot of decision makers, where, whether it be because they were sort of using SaaS stuff anyways, like you mentioned with Office 365 or other items, however way you look at it, just because it's so everywhere. The point is that based off the analyst feedback, we're really expecting, and also feedback we're hearing from people we talk to, we're really expecting that more and more organizations have, who had dismissed cloud in the past, will be willing to consider cloud going forward in 2020. Now, outside both of those issues, there's also the unexpected one, which is coronavirus, which is making a lot of DR and work from home type things really a reality for many businesses quickly, and there's some advantages cloud-wise in that area.
Okay, that makes sense. Another thing that we hear a lot is that companies should move to cloud to get rid of capital expenditure. Does that really work? It's hard to beat the cost of a 5-year server lease after all.
Yeah, this is feedback we get a lot. The key here is understanding total cost. There's a few small businesses that really do not spend much more on IT than the cost of buying some server-like machine from, a Dell or someone like that. However, more often than not, the costs are much bigger. They're just not necessarily as easy and obvious to put together. Maintaining on-site or colo servers have costs like electric, networking, cooling, consulting, installation. There's also software licensing, hardware support, and other similar costs that are often overlooked in that calculation. Because in a cloud scenario, you're getting much of that under that one cost. Then you have to consider the resiliency and scale of the solution you're buying. One of the things that we hear all the time from partners is that when they're going to sell traditional tin for a solution, oftentimes, people have to say, okay, well, I might need something twice as powerful in a year, but that's, 30% more. And I don't know if I'll get there. So I'm going to buy the cheaper model and I'll worry about replacing it if I get there, right? Which gets really expensive in the long term. Or they buy the really expensive one and, may not really need that for quite some time. So there's all these options around, there's all these questions when you're buying tin where you really have to sort of make a decision and stick with it. You don't have to do that in the cloud world. So most of the time, when you really boil it down to apples and you consider some of these other advantages between cloud and onsite, the cloud costs will be the same or less, usually over 3 years. Now, people who use 5 years, and we hear that a lot, comparisons, need to realize that the potential of that plan, especially when you include everything, actually being successful is very low. We've seen technology, it changes really quickly. The fact is that some of that cost will almost definitely come due in less than 5 years. If it's not the hardware, it could be the software, or as we see now, the operating system. People who bought servers 5 years ago could still have gotten it with 2008, which now isn't. Matter of fact, small business server 2008 was still pretty popular 5 years ago. We recently had a partner talk to us about a customer they had with a 5-year plan that assumed they could get hardware support on their servers and EMC storage for about 10% more after the initial 3 years. And then when it came time, about 30 months or so later, they found that they could no longer get service in some of their network equipment at all, like switches. A couple of the switches were just end of life, period. And the server cost was like 15% more, and the storage was like more than double from EMC. So it threw off their whole calculation, 3 years in.
Wow. Okay, so let's say the capex, opex argument isn't relevant. Are there any other compelling reasons to get customers to move?
Well, we hear from many of our partners that the best way is to not lead with the OPEX, CAPEX, and really start from the service level instead. In almost any case, it is hard for an organization to get the same level of services, flexibility, availability, resiliency, even support that's available from a solid cloud platform with on-site servers and internal people, without even close to that same cost, without significant investment. So this is for many a reason to really look at this. And we've touched about some of these sort of issues before, but the fact is that when you take this approach, it's easier to explain to them why those things fall in place and how they all come together, and why cloud sort of gets you further along for around the same investment. And when you really look at it apples to apples, it's cheaper.
You mentioned coronavirus before as a reason why 2020 is a good year for cloud. How would a cloud customer really be better off right now?
Yeah, so COVID-19 is a real concern, and it's actively affecting all of our lives. Let's face it. I want to be clear that if I made it sound like COVID-19 is in some way a good thing for technology, obviously that's not what I meant. It was not my intention. But my point is that COVID-19 has made businesses think about the sort of flexibility and continuity that cloud providers make readily available, similar to other disasters like Sandy in the East Coast of the United States, and then the earthquakes in Japan. We've seen these things, forest fires. All of that just makes it more real. So any company using a cloud will naturally have to consider remote access, right? In many cases, they take advantage of that situation and they put in work from home options as part of that cloud migration, either for production or at least for disaster recovery. So for the ones that do not, it's usually also much easier to add remote access, to a cloud solution than it is necessarily if you have your own environment, your own data center, and it's on premise. It's easier to turn up bandwidth and all that kind of stuff. So taking a cloud solution like Xterra and just turning on remote access, even if you hadn't planned for it before, just tends to be easier and faster. And it can be up and running in a few hours. The software can be rented instead of purchased. Doesn't necessarily need a lot of install time or consulting. And it means that the cloud-based business can generally handle any disaster, including a viral one like coronavirus, with a faster response time.
Okay. So let's say a customer does decide that with everything that's going on, 2020 is the year that they should move. Why should they consider Xterra over the big guys like Amazon's AWS or Microsoft's Azure?
Xterra really has three major benefits versus the major clouds. One, simpler in every way. We're simpler to quote, we're simpler to build, we're simpler to manage, we're simpler to keep track of. We plan and build all of our tools around simplicity and ease of use to ensure that they are intuitive, so customers do not need training or certifications, which are expensive and time consuming. to get in the first place. We're also more cost effective. And this not only means that we're generally less expensive, which we are, to like, it also means that you get a better value on the resources that affect your performance, more processing power, storage, and memory for your money. Finally, it's a fact that we are able to fix price all the services in our cloud catalog. So customers can avoid the kind of surprise charges that they often get from a lot of the major cloud providers. And what's more, we have better support. For the response that our SLA comes with, that's included with our service, it's as good or better than the paid service packages that you get from Amazon or Azure for tens of thousands of dollars on top of the hosting costs. The fact is, problems will happen in technology. Even in the best clouds, managing your IT perfectly, availability is going to have some interruptions. It could be internal, could be the external connectivity, whatever it is. Managing that event via emails every 24 hours just doesn't really cut it. It's a huge change in your ability to control the scenario and provide information to your users and customers, and usually doesn't work.
Okay. You mentioned their billing surprises as one of the reasons why people should consider Xterra over the big boys. What type of surprises are you talking about?
The most common one is by far bandwidth, right? The idea of whether they call it egress charges or transmit charges, however you package it. The point is that, send either too much data out or you use too much data back and forth on certain servers, it can result in a charge. But we also frequently hear about some other runaway costs, like backup costs can get really expensive apparently, and even special costs related to storage, like retrieval fees, encryption fees, and expediting fees apparently can also be big surprises.
Another thing you touched on was support. Why is support such a big deal? I mean, isn't the cloud supposed to never go down?
Well, that is sort of the perception. It's not the reality, as many people who track clouds, whether it be us or Azure or Amazon or any of the big guys, their outages happen. As I said before, problems happen in any IT scenario. Cloud providers take every precaution to avoid them and generally have less of them than most internal IT organizations would, whether it be in a colo or your own data center. However, they do happen. Additionally, there are problems outside of the cloud provider's control, such as operating system issues, software problems, performance issues, connectivity problems, and figuring out how to get to the bottom of those. It requires help. Many of these issues are not technically the cloud provider's fault, but helping to get to the bottom of them and diagnose them can really require some assistance, or is better done with assistance from your cloud provider. So helping you figure those out is a critical aspect of support in the cloud. And ideally, they help you sort out potential direction for resolving them also, because sometimes they have sometimes a cloud provider will have a little bit more either experience or perspective on some of the problems. Sometimes other customers are dealing with them also if they're like a problem with a patch or something, so they can help you along the way. So to do that requires a support staff that's trained on more than just how the cloud console works and what's in an FAQ. It also works best if you're not communicating them solely by trading emails every day or every 12 hours. Xterra has support personnel that have operating system and network experience on top of how the cloud works and the hypervisor works. The average engineer has over 10 years experience, and they've been with Egenera for at least 6. They're not just reading a knowledge base article. They're not just looking at the FAQ. They can also be reached via phone and have remote assistance software to help collaborate more effectively. The end result is a better service.
Excellent. Another thing that you mentioned earlier specifically was Windows 2008 end of life as another reason why 2020 might be the year to move. Can you elaborate a little on that?
Lots of people have stuck with Win 2K8, and they're just now starting to plan how to get off because they really have no choice. That the end has really come. It was delayed how many times? So cloud providers like Xterra can help from several aspects. We can help provide isolated sandbox environments for you to perform your upgrades and your tests on copies and make sure that it actually works as planned before you cut over live to it. We can minimize the large expense of buying the upgraded licenses depending on what your license looks like. and we can help isolate legacy apps that can't be upgraded to minimize the risk to the rest of your IT network. Maybe there are legitimately customers out there and organizations that are going to have to keep one or two Windows 2K8 servers for a little while and run that risk until they can replace a piece of enterprise software. But you don't want that in the same environment with the rest of your stuff. You want to try and mitigate that risk as much as possible.
Absolutely. We actually do see that quite a lot, where applications aren't being updated by the original developers any longer. Businesses still rely on them and they're still looking for replacements. So how about compliance? Many clients approach us about whether cloud can help them achieve compliance with various standards, and this is a confusing subject for most. Does moving to a hosted infrastructure help with compliancy?
Yes, this is confusing. The answer really is sometimes, but not always. Let me explain a little bit. The fact is that most clouds do have certain compliances, like for instance ISO 27001 for all their data centers. That certification is something that may help businesses with like insurance requirements or some other requirements for maybe an RFP, or if they do work with certain government bodies. However, it would be hard and expensive to get if they did it on their own. So getting it with cloud, by going to cloud, they get that automatically because the data centers, it's in that data center. However, on the flip side, there are many popular compliance concerns like SOX, GDPR, GXP, HIPAA. Some of these have actual certification process, while others are just a standard you need to document for. But either way, all of these have a scope that's larger than just the data center, that's larger than just the data center and the cloud provider, which prevents the cloud provider from just giving you compliance because it includes what you do with your servers and what software you have and all that fun stuff. That said, they may be able to help you get there more easily. Xterra, for instance, has policies available for all of our standard activities like change control and so on and so forth that you can take and incorporate in your documentation set that needs to be audited for compliance. So you're tacking on to that. So it sort of saves you how much documentation you have to do. It minimizes the work that a customer might need to submit for a compliance. We also have partners, and I think a couple of our distributors like Briganti also do this, that you can work with where that will help an Xterra customer get certain levels of compliance by helping them complete the documentation and do the audits around it.
That's absolutely true. We work with Brigantia and CyberSmart on that in particular. Another concern that we hear from clients considering a move to the cloud relates to whether they will need to acquire specialised skills in order to maintain it. So what about the skills gap with cloud? Specialist training is expensive. Is that an additional cost that should be considered?
Like I mentioned earlier, Xterra sets itself apart from many clouds by avoiding this sort of cost. Our tools are designed to allow people who've been doing sort of on-premise, regular tin type installs for years to transition to the cloud without any special training and without any certification. On the other hand, there are many clouds that do have training requirements. Some of them even have that training can be really costly, and they actually have certifications too that may need to be maintained. Sometimes these certifications are super pricey, and so much that companies, try to recruit people that already have them, which makes retention a problem for companies going to the cloud because they train people up and then all of a sudden they're getting stolen by another company that doesn't want to pay for that training themselves. So depending on the cloud you decide to go with, certainly can be a concern, so you want to look into this ahead of time.
The reason I asked that question is really for the sake of the listeners, but I know from personal experience how easy it is to use the Xterra platform. Me personally, I'm a technical salesperson, I'm not an engineer, but I myself am able to build and deploy a server infrastructure in Xterra with multiple virtual machines, assign resources, connectivity, licensing, all with relative ease. So I think that's something that speaks volumes for how well constructed the user interface really is and for the transferability of existing skills. So moving on, I'd like to ask about data protection in the cloud. In Europe especially, GDPR is a major concern and a lot of people are very concerned about data protection right now. A client might say to me, when my data's on site, I can point to where it is, I know who can access it, and I know what networks it goes over. How can they have that sort of peace of mind with the cloud?
This is another thing that you really want to look at before selecting a cloud provider. I can tell you from our perspective, Xterra has gone through a lot of effort to make sure that we are what we refer to as geo-locked. We're designed that way from the beginning. Every individual geography can stand on its own. This means that data does not leave the site unless the customer instructs it to happen. So VPNs are terminated to that location. Internet connections go from that location out to a major provider network that's in the same country. Backup and DR locations are all selected specifically by the customer and never change. So we also have no software file systems or object storage that might move your data around between different hosts or buildings and disks within different locations, sometimes even different countries. And our internet providers I mentioned before are all local, so we're not sending it over some big corporate network between different sites and then finding the cheapest, most available internet connection and sending it out there. So we don't have any of that stuff. And that sort of eliminates most of that concern. Now, other clouds may not have that. A lot of the big ones don't, but that's something you want to check into ahead of time.
So by having complete control over your hosted infrastructure, you can have confidence in the security of the data. That makes complete sense. Well, Scott, I think we've covered hosted infrastructure and the benefits of the Xterra platform very well today. It just remains for me to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today.
I appreciate that, and hopefully everyone learned something. I certainly enjoyed being on.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. And that's it from us here at Supreme Systems IT Room Podcast. I hope you'll join us for another one soon. Goodbye and good health.